I am so excited about my next interviewee because she has been a friend of mine for a very long time. She's a reality star. She's a lawyer. She's a mortician. She's everything you ever wanted her to be. Phaedra Parks is on the line. How you doing, Phaedra?
I am so good. I am so super excited to see you. You look so good.
Oh, you look amazing. I got to ask, how are the two little guys doing? Are you having fun with them in quarantine?
Oh, well, homeschooling was a challenge, but it's been really interesting. Thank God we live in a very palatial estate, so that we have lots of different rooms that we can change the scenery and not drive each other absolutely crazy. Yes. So that's been a blessing.
Thank God.
But yeah, the quarantine is, I'm not gonna know how to act when they let me out again, because I've been stuck in the house so long. It's just crazy.
I think you and the rest of the world are feeling the same thing. 2020 has been a little crazy. And, before we get into things, it's such a heavy time for our country right now. And
Definitely.
I saw that you attended Rayshard Brooks's funeral, which was, really just such a touching moment. How
Yes.
good of a job do you think this generation is doing to put a stop, not only to police brutality, but really, systemic racism in this country?
You know what? I directed his funeral yesterday, and it was an honor to serve his family. I escorted his wife, and we had great conversations. And what makes me so proud about your generation is that you all have really just ran with this whole movement. Because, to be very honest, my generation, obviously, we understand racism, but because our parents dealt with it so closely, I remember being taught as a young girl to, do certain things in certain companies so that, obviously you weren't affected by racism. And so it was things that I was just taught, and I knew, okay, so if I go to a grocery store, I always get a bag. I always get my receipt. It's just things I knew not to do. If a police officer ever stopped me, I always knew to be very respectful. Yes, sir. No, sir. And so I think for your generation, you have never felt the sting of racism. And so I can't say that I grew up in a real tense racial environment where it was an everyday thing or anything like that. But, as you well know, I've always been very vocal about racism and about race relations. And so I'm just loving all the young people out marching, protesting. I think it's a little chaotic at times. So I think, it's up to the older generations to really educate the younger protesters on how change happens, because it's great to, march and protest, but you really have to have a real true strategy, and the strategy incorporates government practices, policies, procedures, and really transparent dialogue with people in power. Because I think what everybody wants is equality. And I think that's what's happening now, is your generation is saying, hey, we see this wrong, we want to right it. And I don't know if all, they know the true steps, because I obviously work with the government quite a bit, and a lot of politicians. And so, people ask me questions, well, why didn't the DA do this? And I'm like, right. Well, that's the judge's job. The DA, that's not his position. And so I think a lot of people have time right now to have those very important conversations, to understand what really needs to happen and who's empowered to make that change happen. So I'm super proud to see how people have come together, because after the funeral, we actually drove by the Wendy's where the shooting took place, and it was totally demolished, but there were thousands of young people out there still protesting, and it was, because that was the first time I had seen it in person. And so I was like, wow, it was unbelievable. And it just made, his widow feel so empowered, because that was the first time she drove by it after the incident. And so she, we had a real serious conversation about what this really means for her as a woman. Because she said, I never knew that I would be in this place. And I said, well, this is the place where you have a new purpose. because your purpose is now not just being a mom, but you're going to be the face of a whole movement to actually affect change. And so we talked about some things she wanted to see happen. So it was a real powerful moment yesterday, super powerful.
Well, I mean, that's fantastic that it's been, such a powerful moment, and the younger generation is kind of stepping up to the plate here. You're raising two young ones. Are you hopeful that you're going to be able to raise them and they're able to grow up in a world where, this isn't at least an issue, or at least not as big of an issue, an epidemic, if you will?
Well, when people talk about COVID-19 and COVID-16-19, obviously that we've been fighting for a lifetime. And people ask me, do your boys know about this? And I haven't taken them to any protests because of the virus. And I'm very concerned with making sure everyone's healthy and safe. But my youngest son, who's 7, he, saw the whole George Floyd thing and said, Mom, could you please explain it to me? And so you would start explaining, and he says, well, why would they do that? And so it was a very interesting conversation. But as a Black parent to African-American boys, I'm always having conversations. And so when even the thing with Papa John's happened, I said, hey, as African-American consumers, we will not patronize Papa John's because of what they did. And they said, well, why? And I said, because they made statements that were, unfair to, people of color. And so I'm always educating them, but I try not to make it so heavy because they are young boys, but because you do have the Tamir Rice situations that happen, I have to be very cognizant because we live on the most affluent street in Atlanta. So there's not a lot of people, that look like us, but I also want them to know that, hey, you have to be very aware of who's around and how you're conducting yourself because, it's not fair, but it is history. This is what's happening in America right now. And so it's a hard discussion, but it's a discussion that people should have been having. It's a discussion that is long overdue. And so I tell people, we had the Me Too movement, but I think this is the About Time movement, about time that racism is at the forefront and people talk about it and just be really honest, I went to a girls' school and, me and my best friend, she's a white woman, and we have real discussions about the difference in being a white mom and a Black mom. And, even she talks about how she washed my hair in college. It was like, your hair's so different, but it's so soft. And, and how she was like, at first she was like, oh my gosh, how do I wash a Black woman's hair? Because I hurt my arm in a swimming match. But, so those are the conversations that people need to have because we are different, but not so different that we can't come together and make this a beautiful thing.